The line for Elspeth's Perry snaked past the dusty poultry cages, past the dispirited jam competition, and all the way back to the livestock pens, where the heat and the flies made a thick, shimmering curtain in the September air. It was a line of thirsty, grim-faced men and women whose apple orchards had failed, whose corn had withered, and whose wells were thinking of giving up. And at the head of that line, a young woman they had all pitied or scorned 3 months ago was methodically filling cup after cup from a wooden keg, her face calm and her movement steady. Silas Croft, whose cider had won the blue ribbon for 10 years running, stood by his empty booth, his own barrels as dry as the creek bed. He watched her, his face a knot of curdled pride. He saw the coins dropping into her tin box. He heard the murmurs of gratitude, and the sight was a pestle grinding his bones to dust. Every drop she sold was a testament to his own monumental mistake, a mistake that had cost him $4 and the respect of the entire county. He had sold her a barrel of what he called waste, and she had somehow, impossibly, turned it into the only thing worth drinking at the fair. It had all started 3 months earlier, on a June morning that still held the promise of rain. Elspeth had gone across farm not to buy, but to ask for work. She had a small plot of land left to her by parents she barely remembered, a cabin that leaned into the wind, and an independence that the town mistook for foolishness. A woman alone, they said, couldn't work a place. She'd starve or marry, and since no one was asking, starvation seemed the more likely outcome. Croft, a man whose wealth had made him arrogant and whose arrogance had made him cruel, looked down at her from the seat of his wagon. Her hands were clean but calloused. Her dress was patched but neat. He saw not a potential worker, but an object of casual disdain. "No work here for you, girl," he'd said, his voice slick with false pity. "But I might have a business proposition." He gestured with his thumb toward the back of his cider house, where a single barrel stood apart from the others, buzzing with flies. "That's a barrel of Bartlett pears from the South Slope. Got bruised in the hail last week. They're turning. Not fit for market, not fit for cider. They'll be rot by tomorrow." He squinted at her. "You can haul it off for $4. Maybe your pigs will eat it." He didn't add that she had no pigs. Everyone knew she had no pigs. The offer was an insult wrapped in commerce. It was a way of saying, "Here, take my garbage. It's all you're worth." The men loading his wagons paused, leaning on their shovels, smirking. They were waiting for her to flush with shame, to refuse and stalk away. Instead, Elspeth walked over to the barrel. The air around it was thick with the scent of overripe fruit, a smell that was half perfume, half decay. She looked past the brown spots and the split skins, seeing not what they were, but what they contained: sugar, water, and time. She did the arithmetic in her head. $4 was almost everything she had. It was a risk that felt like leaping from a cliff in the dark. But the alternative was a slow slide into nothing. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "I'll take it," she said. The men's smirks widened into open laughter. Silas Croft himself let out a short, barking laugh. He took her 4 carefully counted dollars as if he were doing her a great favor. "Don't come crying to me when you're just burying a barrel of stink," he called after her as she began the long, grueling task of rolling the heavy cask onto her small handcart. She didn't answer. Being right, she was beginning to learn, was its own kind of reply, and it was best served cold. The journey home was a mile of dust and humiliation. Every farm she passed, someone was there to watch. The barrel was unwieldy, the handcart's wheels threatening to splinter in the ruts of the road. More than once, she had to stop, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning, and wedge a rock under the cask while she caught her breath. The sun beat down, warming the pears, hastening their turn toward rot. She could feel the town's judgment like a physical weight, heavier even than the barrel itself. There goes foolish Elspeth, hauling Croft's garbage. Spent her last dollar on mush. She heard the whispers from porches and behind curtains. She saw the pity in some faces, the raw mockery in others. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her jaw set. Loneliness was a familiar coat, and she wore it buttoned to the chin. Her own small homestead was a relief when she finally reached it. The cabin was little more than a single room, but it was hers. The land was rocky, but a small vegetable patch showed her stubborn effort. She maneuvered the barrel into the shade of the one great oak that grew by her door and slumped against it, exhausted and awash with a sudden, sickening wave of doubt. The smell of the pears was stronger now, cloying. What had she done? Wasted her money, made herself a laughingstock, and all she had to show for it was a barrel of fermenting mash. For a long moment, she considered just letting it sit there, letting it fulfill the town's prophecy and collapse into a foul, liquid mess. One person alone. The phrase echoed in her mind, the town's verdict. It was not a description, it was a condemnation. But then she thought of Old Man Hemlock. He lived another mile down the creek, a recluse from the old country who spoke in clipped, strange sentences and was said to know things about the land that others had forgotten. The town was wary of him, but he had always been kind to her, once showing her which mushrooms were safe to eat after a rain. She took a dipper of water and walked. She found him sitting on his porch, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. He listened to her story without interruption, his pale blue eyes never leaving her face. When she was done, he set down his carving and looked toward the hazy hills. "They call it waste, Elspeth," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But waste is just a thing whose purpose you have not yet seen." He rose slowly, his joints creaking. "Pears are not apples. They have a different heart. You cannot bully them. You must persuade them." He led her into his small, cool barn. In the corner stood a small, sturdy-looking press and a collection of glass carboys. "Your pears are soft," he said. "That is a gift. The hail did half your work. You will not need to grind them hard. Press them gently. Let the juice run. Give it a cool, dark place to think. And do not listen to the town. Listen to the barrel. It will tell you when it is ready." He gave her a small packet of dried yeast, folded in wax paper. "This will give it courage," he said. "The rest is patience." She walked home not with a solution, but with something far more valuable, a map. The work began the next morning, before the sun had burned the dew from the grass. The first task was sorting. She tipped the barrel onto a clean canvas sheet and plunged her hands into the sticky, fragrant mass. It was a job for the senses. Her fingers learned to distinguish between the soft brown of a simple bruise and the watery collapse of true rot. Anything with mold was discarded, tossed far into the woods. The merely bruised, the split, the misshapen, these were the treasure. Wasps, drunk on the sweetness, rose in a lazy, buzzing cloud. The juice ran down her arms to her elbows, sticky and warm. It took her the entire day, working with a focus that shut out the world, to separate the good from the lost. By evening, she had a mountain of usable fruit and a smaller, but still significant, pile of true garbage. Her back ached, and her hands were stained, but the sickening doubt of the day before was gone, replaced by the clean feeling of labor. A boy had been watching her from the fence line that separated her property from the next. It was Finn, the youngest son of the Miller family, a quiet, watchful child of about 10. He had said nothing all day, just observed her with an unnerving stillness. As she was washing her hands at the pump, he finally spoke. "What are you making?" His voice was small, hesitant. The Millers were proud people, and she knew they'd warned their children to keep their distance from the foolish girl. "Something new," Elspeth said, not unkindly. "Or something old. Depends on who you ask. My pa said Mr. Croft cheated you," Finn said, his eyes on the pile of pears. "Maybe," Elspeth replied, drying her hands on her apron. "Or maybe Mr. Croft just doesn't know what he has." The next morning, Finn was back. He didn't ask if he could help. He just picked up a bucket and began carrying the sorted pears to the small, hand-crank press she had jury-rigged from an old wagon jack and timbers, following Hemlock's design. He was a silent, efficient partner. They worked in a rhythm, Elspeth feeding the fruit into the press, Finn turning the heavy crank with all his might. The first trickle of juice was a revelation. It was cloudy, pale gold, and smelled of summer. It was not the scent of rot, but of pure, concentrated pear. They worked for 2 days straight, their world shrinking to the press, the buckets, the growing pool of liquid. The physical effort was immense. The press was clumsy and inefficient, demanding all of Elspeth's strength to produce a steady flow. Finn, though small, was tireless, his face set with a seriousness that was older than his years. Together, they filled every container she owned, her pickling crocks, her water barrel, even a collection of old clay jugs. The cabin began to smell like an orchard. They had extracted nearly 40 gallons of raw juice. It was a start, a beginning, a possibility. It was more than anyone in town thought she could make. It was more than she had dared to hope for herself. Now came the part that was not labor, but faith. Following Hemlock's instructions, she added the yeast to the juice, stirring it gently with a clean wooden paddle. She and Finn covered the crocks with cheesecloth and moved them into the cool, dark quiet of her root cellar. And then they waited. For the first few days, nothing happened. Elspeth would go down into the cellar 3 times a day, holding a lantern, peering at the still, silent surfaces of the juice. The arithmetic began to haunt her sleep. $4 for the pears. She'd had to spend another $1 on sugar to help the fermentation, $1 she'd earned by mending shirts for the blacksmith's wife. She would need bottles, corks. Each one was a small cost that, added together, formed a wall she wasn't sure she could climb. If this failed, she would have nothing. Not just no money, but no standing. She would be the town fool for good, the girl who bought rotten fruit and made sour water. The thought was a cold stone in her gut. On the 4th day, she went down into the cellar and heard it. A soft, gentle hissing. Leaning closer to the largest crock, she saw a tiny bubble rise to the surface and pop. Then another and another. A thin layer of foam was gathering at the edge. The yeast was alive. It was eating the sugar. It was working. A slow smile spread across her face, the first in a long time. It was a private victory, a secret joy shared only with the damp earth walls of the cellar. Finn came by every day after his chores, and his first question was always, "Is it bubbling?" They would go down into the cellar together, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows, and listen to the gentle fizzing. To them, it was the most beautiful sound in the world, the sound of transformation. Over the next few weeks, the bubbling grew more vigorous, a steady, happy ferment. The cellar filled with a sharp, clean, winey smell. Elspeth read the one book she owned, a tattered almanac, over and over, its passages on weather and planting seasons less interesting to her now than the small section on cider making. Pears weren't mentioned, but she adapted the principles. She learned the term for racking, siphoning the liquid off the sediment at the bottom, and she and Finn did it with a makeshift hose, carefully transferring the clearing liquid to cleaner containers, leaving the cloudy dregs behind. The town, for its part, seemed to have forgotten her. The brief entertainment of her foolish purchase had passed. There were other things to talk about, the unsettling lack of rain, the way the corn was starting to tassel at half its normal height. Silas Croft drove his wagon past her lane once, slowing his horse to peer at her cabin. He saw nothing but a quiet homestead, a girl tending her vegetable patch. He grunted, satisfied, and drove on. He could not see the miracle happening in the cool dark beneath her feet. He could not smell the slow, patient alchemy turning his waste into gold. He saw only what he had wanted to see, a failure. The bubbling slowed, week by week, until one day in late July, it stopped. The cellar fell silent again. The liquid in the crocks and jugs had cleared to a beautiful pale straw color. According to Hemlock's advice and her almanac, the time had come. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she siphoned a small amount into a tin cup. Her hand trembled as she raised it to her lips. She had no idea what to expect. A sour, vinegary disappointment? A cloying, unfinished sweetness? She took a sip, and her eyes widened. It was not sweet. The yeast had consumed nearly all the sugar. Instead, it was crisp, dry, and startlingly clean on the palate. It was light, almost delicate, but with a definite, lingering ghost of pear that blossomed at the back of her throat. It was shot through with millions of tiny, effervescent bubbles that danced on her tongue. It was good. It was more than good. It was delicious. She took another, longer drink, letting the cool liquid slide down her throat. It had worked. The simple, profound truth of it settled over her, a warm and steadying weight. She had taken $4 and a barrel of scorn and made this. A feeling of quiet, fierce pride filled her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. She called for Finn, who came running. She poured a small amount into a cup for him. He sniffed it suspiciously, then took a tentative sip. His face lit up. "It tastes like stars," he breathed. It was the perfect description. She spent the next week bottling. She had spent her mending money on a small collection of second-hand bottles from a peddler, and she and Finn washed and sterilized each one. They filled them carefully, corked them tightly, and laid them on their sides in the darkest corner of the cellar. This was her treasure, her insurance against the winter, her answer to the town. She kept the success of it a secret, banked low like a coal under ash, letting it gather its strength in the dark. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that its time would come. The world was not yet ready to see what she had done, and she was not yet ready to show it. "Patience," Hemlock had said. "The barrel will tell you when it is ready." And now, the bottles would do the same. They lay in the cool silence, waiting for their moment, for the world outside to grow thirsty enough to listen. And the world was, indeed, growing very thirsty. A broken wagon changed everything. It happened on a blistering day in early August. A well-dressed merchant from the city, a Mr. Albright, was making his way to the next town when his wagon hit a deep rut right at the end of Elspeth's lane, snapping the axle with a sound like a gunshot. Albright was a man accustomed to comfort, and the heat, the dust, and the predicament made him short-tempered. He saw Elspeth working in her garden and hailed her with an air of command. "You there, girl? I need water for my horse, and a man to send for the blacksmith." Elspeth looked at his florid, sweating face and simply nodded. She gave his horse water and sent Finn running to fetch the smith, a journey of 2 miles. While he waited, Albright paced in the meager shade of the oak, fanning himself with his hat and complaining about the wretched state of country roads. Elspeth offered him a dipper of water from her well. He drank it, but still looked miserable. "It's this heat," he grumbled. "Dries a man right out. In the city, you can get a cool glass of cider. Out here, nothing." On an impulse she did not fully understand, Elspeth made a decision. "I have something that might help," she said. She went into her cabin, and then down into the cellar, returning a moment later with a single, unlabeled bottle, cool and dewy from the dark. She opened it and poured the pale, sparkling liquid into a clean glass. She handed it to him without a word. Albright looked at it with suspicion. "What's this?" "Not water, Perry," she said. "It's made from pears," he snorted, but he was too thirsty to refuse. He took a long swallow. His pacing stopped. He stood perfectly still in the dusty yard, the glass halfway to his lips. He lowered it slowly, staring at it as if he'd never seen such a thing before. He took another, more deliberate sip, rolling it around in his mouth. His cynical, merchant's eyes fixed on her, but now they held a completely different expression. It was not condescension. It was calculation. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I made it from what?" "Pears, what kind of pears?" he pressed. "Bruised ones," she said simply. Albright let out a low whistle. He drained the glass. "Young woman," he said, his tone entirely changed, "you have a gold mine in that cellar. This is remarkable. It's light, it's elegant. The ladies in the city would go mad for it. It's not heavy and sweet like most of the farmhouse swill. It's sophisticated." He looked from the glass to her, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see her, not as a country girl, but as a producer of a valuable commodity. "How much do you have?" "Enough," she said, her heart starting to beat faster. "I'll buy it," he said immediately. "I'll buy every last bottle." She thought of the coming winter, of the security his money would bring. But she also thought of the fair, of her promise to herself. "I can sell you 2 crates," she said. "The rest is for the county fair." He argued, he cajoled, he offered a price that made her head spin. But she stood firm. In the end, he bought the 2 crates, 24 bottles, for a price that was more money than she had ever held in her hand at one time. He paid her in crisp bills, his respect now palpable. "I'll be back after this fair of yours," he said as he left with his repaired wagon. "And I expect you'll be the talk of the county." As his dust settled, Elspeth looked at the money in her hand. It was real. Someone from the outside, someone who knew quality, had confirmed what she had only hoped. The secret was out just a little, and as she looked up at the sky, a sky that was a pale, bleached-out blue with no promise of clouds, she knew its time was coming faster than she had thought. The heat had just begun. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The rainless sky of July gave way to a sky that seemed to actively bake the moisture from the earth. The creek that bordered Elspeth's property shrank from a stream to a trickle, and then to a series of stagnant, muddy pools. The corn in the fields turned brown and brittle before it was knee-high. The wells in town grew stingy, offering up bucketfuls of gritty, bitter water. But the greatest devastation was in the apple orchards. The trees, stressed by the lack of water, began to drop their fruit. The apples that fell were small, hard, and bitter, more like wooden balls than fruit. The ones that clung to the branches withered, their skins wrinkling like the faces of old men. For Silas Croft, it was a catastrophe. His wealth, his pride, his identity were all tied to his apples. He walked his dusty orchards in a daze, watching his fortune shrivel on the branch. There would be no cider this year. Not from him, not from anyone. The entire county's crop was a failure. The mood in the town soured with the heat. The usual lazy summer gossip was replaced by a low, constant hum of anxiety. People's faces grew tight, their tempers short. The mockery Elspeth had endured was a distant memory, a triviality from a time of abundance. Now, the fear was real. There would be little to sell, little to store for the winter. Hunger was no longer a vague threat. It was a certainty, waiting just beyond the harvest season. Elspeth's small garden survived because she was careful. She watered it each evening with gray water from her cabin, a bucket at a time, keeping the roots alive. She watched the land, saw the growing desperation, and felt a quiet dread mix with her secret knowledge. Her 40 gallons of Perry, resting cool and safe in the cellar, had transformed. It was no longer a speculative venture. It was one of the only stores of preserved value in the entire community. It was liquid hope. She told no one about Mr. Albright or the money he had paid her. She hid the cash in a loose stone in her hearth and went about her days, her manner as calm and unassuming as ever. But the town was beginning to remember her. The story of the Bruised Pears was recalled, but the tone had changed. It was no longer a joke. It was a puzzle. Whispers started. What had become of that barrel? Had she really just fed it to the pigs she didn't have? Curiosity began to gnaw at the edges of the town's despair. Pride and hunger are terrible neighbors. The Millers, Finn's family, were hit as hard as anyone. Their corn was a total loss. Mr. Miller, a proud and taciturn man, grew grimmer by the day. Elspeth saw the worry in Finn's eyes, and one evening, she gave him a bottle of the Perry to take home. "For your parents," she said. "Tell them it's a gift. For all your help." He took it, his gratitude shining in his face. It was a small gesture, but in that dry and desperate time, it was a profound one. It was the first drop of a generosity that would soon be tested on a much larger scale. Silas Croft's envy was a sickness that grew with the drought. He had lost everything, while the foolish girl he had swindled had, by some devil's luck, stumbled into success. He couldn't stand it. The whispers in town about her pears reached him, and he became obsessed. He had to know what she had done. He came to her homestead one afternoon, his approach stripped of its usual arrogance, replaced by a veneer of slick, neighborly concern. "Elspeth," he said, his voice oozing false warmth as she met him at her door. "Just checking on my neighbors in this terrible time. A woman alone. It must be difficult." She said nothing, her stillness a wall he couldn't find a foothold on. "I was just thinking about that old barrel of pears," he went on, trying to sound casual. "Such a shame they went to waste. I feel bad I even took your money for them. Didn't go to waste," she said. Her voice was level, giving nothing away. A flicker of something, anger, frustration, crossed his face before he smoothed it over. "Well, that's good to hear," he said. "I've been thinking, with the cider all lost, people will be looking for something to drink at the fair. If you manage to put up a few jars of pear sauce, I could sell them at my booth for you. Take a small commission, of course, to help you out. The offer was ludicrous, an attempt to pry his way into her business, to control what he now suspected was a valuable asset. "Thank you, Mr. Croft, but I have my own plans," she said. His smile tightened. "Don't be proud, girl. You don't understand business. You have to know the market, the pricing. You'll be cheated." He took a step closer, tried to peer past her into the cabin, his eyes searching for any sign of her operation. "Let me help you. Just tell me what you've made, how much you have." "We could be partners. We are not partners, Mr. Croft." The finality in her tone was unmistakable. The mask of friendliness fell away completely, revealing the raw greed beneath. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "You think you can stand against me? A slip of a girl with a barrel of rotten fruit? I'll see you ruined." He stormed away, his threats hanging in the hot, still air. Later that week, Finn found footprints in the dust around the cellar door. Someone had been there in the night, testing the lock, trying to look through the small, high window. Finn knew who it was. Elspeth knew who it was. The threat was no longer just about mockery or envy. It was about theft. She reinforced the lock and began sleeping with an old, heavy iron poker by her bed. She was one person alone, and for the first time, she felt the chill of that reality. The fair was only a week away. She had to hold on. She had to protect what she had built, not just for herself, but for the principle of the thing. She would not let him bully her. She would not let him take what he had thrown away and she had redeemed. The day of the county fair dawned hazy and hot. The grounds, usually bustling with energy, were subdued. The dust was thick, coating everything in a layer of brown grit. There were no prize-winning pumpkins, no mountains of shining apples. The competition tables were sparsely populated with withered-looking vegetables and small jars of preserves. It was a fair of scarcity, a reflection of the town's mood. Silas Croft's large, prominent booth stood empty, a monument to the drought. He was there, however, leaning against a post, watching the crowd with a proprietary air, as if he still presided over the day's fortunes. Elspeth and Finn arrived with her small handcart, loaded with 4 wooden kegs and a box of tin cups. They found a small, unclaimed spot between a quilt seller and a man selling snake oil. They set up a simple plank on 2 crates for a counter. Elspeth hammered a hand-painted sign into the ground. Elspeth's Perry. 2 cents a cup. She had spent nights agonizing over the price. She knew, in this thirsty town, she could ask for 5 cents, maybe even 10. The arithmetic of profit was tempting, but the arithmetic of community was more compelling. She remembered the faces of her neighbors, the worry in their eyes. 2 cents was fair. It was a price that would allow everyone a taste of comfort, a moment of relief from the heat and the hardship. It was not the price of a monopolist. It was the price of a neighbor. For the first hour, people walked by, curious but hesitant. Then the sheriff, a big man whose face was permanently flushed from the sun, stopped. "Perry, huh," he said, reading the sign. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." Elspeth filled a cup and handed it to him. He took a long, slow drink. He closed his eyes. A broad smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice booming across the quiet fairgrounds. "That's the finest thing I've tasted all year." He paid his 2 cents, then turned to the crowd. "Folks, you best get some of this before it's gone." That was all it took. The first few customers became a dozen. Then the dozen became a line. The news spread like wildfire. "There's something to drink at the fair. Something cold and good." The line grew longer and longer, a testament to the county's collective thirst. Elspeth and Finn worked without stopping, filling cups, taking coins. She saw the surprise and then the gratitude on people's faces as they paid the modest price. They had expected to be gouged. They were being treated with respect. Croft watched the scene, his face growing darker with every cup she sold. He could not stand it. He began to walk along the line, whispering his poison. "Don't drink that," he'd say to one man. "It's made from rotten fruit. Probably give you the colic." To a woman, he'd murmur, no telling what she put in it. "A witch's brew, most likely," but the people were too thirsty and the Perry was too good. His words were just bitter dust in the wind. When a man laughed at him, Croft lost his temper. He strode to the front of the line and confronted Elspeth. "This is a fraud," he shouted, his voice cracking. You're selling poison to these people." The sheriff stepped forward. "Now hold on, Silas. I've had a cup. It's better than any of that sugary cider you've been selling for years." "She stole the recipe," Croft bellowed, his desperation making him reckless. "It's an old family recipe of mine. She must have stolen it." A quiet voice spoke up from the crowd. It was Old Man Hemlock, who rarely came to town. "That is not true, Mr. Croft," he said, his accent cutting through the noise. "The girl came to me. I taught her the old way. It is a way of patience and care. It is not a thing that can be stolen. It must be learned," the crowd murmured, their allegiance shifting decisively. Croft was exposed, his lies laid bare by the simple truth. Shamed and furious, he pushed his way through the crowd and stormed off, his reign as the king of the fair officially over. By late afternoon, the last keg was empty. Elspeth's tin box was heavy with coins. But the real profit wasn't in the box. It was in the faces of the people who came up to her as she packed up. "Thank you, Elspeth," they said. "Not girl, but her name. That was a fine thing you did," they saw her now. Not the town fool, but a smart, hard-working woman who had seen value where they had only seen waste, and who had shared her good fortune when she could have hoarded it. The fair marked a turning point, not just for Elspeth, but for the town. The respect she had earned, cup by cup, was more solid and lasting than any fortune. People no longer looked at her with pity or suspicion. They looked at her with a kind of wonder. She had become one of them, not by conforming, but by proving them wrong with quiet competence and a generous spirit. The money from the fair and from Mr. Albright was enough. It was enough to buy supplies for the winter, to purchase 2 young pigs, to put a new roof on the cabin, and to place an order for a proper screw press for the following year. She was no longer living on the edge of ruin. She was secure. A few days after the fair, Mrs. Miller, Finn's mother, came to her door. She was a proud woman who had always kept her distance, but now her face was humbled. She held out a freshly baked loaf of bread. "We have little to trade," she said, her voice strained. "But my husband, he wonders if you might spare a few bottles. He would be willing to help you clear the rocks from your lower field in exchange." It was not a request for charity, but an offer of mutual respect. It was the beginning of a new economy in the valley, one based not on cash and condescension, but on skill and need. "I would like that very much," Elspeth said, accepting the bread. The rains finally came in October, a slow, gentle soaking that was a balm on the cracked earth. The world turned green again. Mr. Albright returned as promised, and he signed a contract with her for half of the next year's production, at a price that guaranteed her prosperity. He told her the Perry was a sensation in the city, sold in fancy hotels for $1 a bottle. She just smiled. One crisp autumn evening, she sat on her porch with Old Man Hemlock. Finn was nearby, stacking firewood for her, whistling a tuneless song. Elspeth poured 2 glasses of the last of the Perry. They drank in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was clean and cool, full of the promise of a cold winter and a fresh spring. Hemlock swirled the Perry in his glass, admiring the color in the fading light. "You see," he said, his voice soft. "They called it waste, a barrel of rot." He looked at her, his pale eyes full of a deep, knowing kindness. "But waste is just a thing whose purpose you have not yet seen. You had the eyes to see it, Elspeth. That is all." She looked out over her small plot of land. She saw the sturdy cabin, the neat woodpile, the sleeping garden. It was not a grand estate like Silas Croft's, but it was hers. Every inch of it had been earned through patience, observation, and hard work. She had listened not to the town, but to the barrel. She had taken their scorn and her own doubt and fermented them into something bright and clear and full of stars. She was a woman alone, but she was not lonely. She had found her purpose, and it had been there all along, hiding in the bruises, waiting for someone with the eyes to see.